Welcome to Real Estate School. We're introducing our next series of videos, the 5 most important concepts you need to understand to pass your real estate licensing exam. Our first video in the series, Real Estate Agency. Agency is a very important concept to understand, whether you're trying to pass your state's real estate license exam or just staying out of trouble while you're in business. Understand in the real estate world, we have both relationships that are customer relationships and client relationships, customer and client. The client is the person who has hired you and your broker to represent them, to defend them, and look out after their best interest throughout their real estate transaction, whether that be buyer, seller, landlord, or tenant. There is a lot of obligations that go along with agreeing to represent somebody. They are not just moral or ethical obligations, they are legal obligations. Under the common law of agency, an agent owes their client the 6 duties of care, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, accounting, and confidentiality, which can be remembered by the acronym COLD AC. Well, these obligations don't happen by accident. In most states, state law says that in order to form that representation, you need a written agreement to form that representation and to be obligated to those responsibilities. Now, when it comes to a seller, for some reason, we don't have any problem thinking about this. We meet with the seller, discuss the marketing services you and your broker will provide to bring about a sale of their home, discuss a variety of price ranges to help the seller realistically price their house, and then you proceed to sign a listing agreement. Now your broker can put their sign in their front yard. You and your broker are representing the seller through the signing of this listing agreement. It's an employment contract. An employment contract that creates the agency relationship. Well, it's the same thing for a buyer. You do not represent a buyer legally unless that, in most states, unless that buyer has signed a representation agreement with you, hiring you and your broker to represent them and look out after their best interest throughout their real estate purchase. Without that written agreement, the buyer is a customer. By definition, a customer is an unrepresented third party. You might even want to jot that down, an unrepresented third party. When I say unrepresented, can't you see the young couple sitting around the apartment having that discussion? We've been renting for 2 years, throwing our money away. We need to buy a home. And they get on the internet, various websites, looking at properties on the market for sale, maybe even picked up the phone and talked to an agent or two about a listing, but they've yet to sign a representation agreement with any broker. So at this point, they're representing themselves. They're an unrepresented party, and they're a third party. You and your broker are one party. The seller of the home you're discussing is the second party. That leaves this buyer to be the third party, an unrepresented third party. Important concept that you need to understand. Write this down. When the buyer is a customer, we represent the seller in all cases. Our real estate system is a system of sub-agency. We've agreed going into this that if we're not the buyer's agent, that we're representing the seller. So you always are representing somebody in a real estate transaction, and you need to understand this. You know, and to fully understand it, it helps to go back and look at the history of agency. Back in the 1950s, generally there was one broker involved in a real estate transaction. That broker would list the seller's home for sale, market the property, through their marketing efforts, locate a buyer, but never represent the buyer. The buyer was always unrepresented. The buyer was always a customer. We did not give that buyer advice and counsel. I guess the thinking was it's the seller paying the commissions, it's the seller that gets representation. Well, in the 1960s, things evolved. The brokers started to share listings. The system worked so well, they created the MLS systems. brokers sharing listings, each other's listings, resulting in two brokers cooperating to sell a property. But even under this arrangement, both brokers represented the seller. One broker had the home listed, another broker produced the buyer, but both brokers were representing the seller. The listing agent had a direct contract with the seller through the signing of the listing agreement, and the broker that produced the buyer was the sub-agent of the listing agent representing the seller as well. The buyer was a customer. It was not until the mid-90s, would you believe, mid-90s. I know what some of you are thinking, that's when I was born. Well, to me, the mid-90s were just yesterday. That most states developed the concept of representing a buyer in a real estate transaction, which, by the way, created another situation where now we could have a buyer, an agent that's representing a buyer and a seller in the same transaction. But that wasn't possible till we had buyer representation. So I guess the two sides of the coin that you really need to understand. Number one, you need to understand what position you're in with a buyer. In what situation are you representing the buyer or the seller? Very important that you understand this. But number two is the consumer understanding what position they are in with you. You know, we take classes on this. We learn all about this in schools, but the general consumer doesn't understand. So we now have what they call mandatory disclosure laws in every state that dictate when, how, and to whom disclosure must be made. You know, for me, it usually starts with a phone call. A buyer calls up and says, I saw your listing, can you tell me about it? The very first question I'm required to ask this buyer at this point, I know what most of you are thinking, yes, are you being represented? I'm asking this question for two different reasons. Number one, I happen to be looking for my next client. This is not my client yet. I hope they say they are not represented because they could become my client in the future. If they tell me yes, they are represented, there's pretty much nothing I could do or should be doing for this buyer other than referring them back to their agent. I can't help you go call your real estate agent. Again, I'm hoping they say no. But if they do say no, I do not have an agent. Alarm bells should go off. They've just identified themselves as an unrepresented third party. And brings up rule number two. Rule number one was the buyer is a customer. We always represent the seller. Rule number two is we always disclose who we represent to the party that's not being represented. We always disclose who we represent to the party that's not being represented. When that buyer just disclosed to me that they're unrepresented, my job is to let them know before I discuss my listing that I am the one representing the seller. What I'm telling this buyer is I'm planning on using my training and my skills on my seller's behalf. I'm not coming right out and saying that, but that's my purpose. I liken it to these old karate movies. Remember these old karate movies? Before I beat you up, I have to let you know these hands are registered as lethal weapons. Before I tell you about my listing, I have to make sure you understand that I'm going to use my training and skill on my seller's behalf. So we always disclose who we represent to the party that's not being represented. So let's talk about this representation agreement then. You know, a representation agreement, as we said, is a contract. And it would be rare that a buyer that you've never met before is going to be willing to sign a contract with you up front. You've never met. This contract, the buyer is committing to working with you exclusively for a period of time. I'm not going to work with any other agent. And when I find a house to buy, you will get a 3% commission. Even if the seller is only paying 2%, I'll agree to pay the difference out of my pocket. You know, if I told a buyer before I show you a home, you have to sign a contract with me, that's probably not going to work. So most of my relationships start with the buyer as a customer relationship, where I'm showing properties to the buyer as a customer. But the whole time I'm showing homes to the buyer as a customer, I'm reminding the buyer that, I'm representing the seller in all these all these properties I'm showing you. So I really can't give you advice on, like, is this a good price or not? See, if you're my client, we can go back to the office, sit down in front of the computer, look at some comparable listings in the market that have sold recently. Maybe that's a high price. Maybe we should come in and offer a lower price. But as a customer, I'm representing the seller. So if I told you to offer a lower price, that would be misrepresenting my seller. So I think it's very important at one point that a buyer, and I tell buyers this, that you need to sign a representation agreement with an agent. I'm hoping it's me, if not hire somebody to represent you, because you need proper advice and guidance throughout the purchase price. Is this a good price to offer? Once the home's under contract, what repair should I ask the seller to make after we do a home inspection? Only your agent can give you that advice. So yeah, at one point, a buyer, I'm hoping it's me, but you need to sign that buyer representation agreement. We need the buyer to sign that representation agreement because all the time that we spend with this buyer as a customer showing them homes, we are a volunteer with our time. We can call this buyer up one day and say, we spend a month with this buyer showing the homes. We call them up one day and say, a new listing hit the market. I know it's exactly what you're looking for. Let's go take a look. And they can say, no, thank you. I bought another home from another agent yesterday. I don't need your services anymore. And they could do that because they never have made any written commitment to you to pay you a commission when they buy a home. That happens in the buyer representation agreement. So yes, again, we both need that representation agreement. We need the representation agreement to protect our time we invested with this buyer person, and they need it for proper guidance and advice through the purchase process. Without that representation agreement, the buyer is a customer, and in all properties that we are going to show this buyer, we're representing the seller. Well, we hope this video has helped you understand the concepts of real estate agency better. Understanding the concepts will make answering questions on your real estate licensing exam that much easier. Well, we're working hard on new videos every day, so if you hit that bell below and subscribe, you'll be notified of our next video. Thank you.